Muskogee Media presents What is Tribal Sovereignty? All of the functions and services of the Muskogee Creek Nation government are directly tied to tribal sovereignty. But what exactly is it and how did it come to be? Let's take a look at the concept of tribal sovereignty. In order to understand tribal sovereignty, we first have to examine the concept of sovereignty generally. Sovereignty is the supreme independent authority within a territory. There are three key components to the definition of a sovereign. The first concept is that the sovereign has authority, or the right to command and to be obeyed, that is derived from a mutually acknowledged source of legitimacy from within the community. The second concept is that the authority of the sovereign is supreme, and it is superior to all other authorities in its domain. The final component is the territory of the sovereign, which defines the community or group that falls under its authority. The individuals that reside within the geographic boundaries of the sovereign are subject to its authority. Before European contact, Native American tribes were already employing the concept of sovereignty to treat with each other. Tribes and tribal towns would make agreements and treaties in order to end sustained conflicts and promote growth and well-being in their own respective tribes. European contact later established a pattern of recognition of tribal sovereignty through treaties and legal framework that continued throughout the American Revolution and the establishment of the United States. The United States is a federated state, which means that a group of states, in this case, the 50 U.S. states, have transferred a portion of their sovereign powers over to a federal government, so that federal union becomes the sovereign entity representing those states for the purposes of international law. In relation to federally recognized Indian tribes, this means that while the tribes are equal and thus not beholden to state governments, the federal government does still have authority over them. The federal government recognizes the Muskogee Creek Nation as a domestic dependent nation, a classification derived from the U.S. Supreme Court case Cherokee Nation v. Georgia. In this case, the Cherokee Nation attempted to obtain a federal injunction against laws passed by the state of Georgia that deprived them of rights within its boundaries. In what would later become a pattern of erosion of tribal sovereignty, the court did not hear the case, but chose not to rule on the merits, determining that the framers of the U.S. Constitution did not consider Indian tribes as foreign nations, but more as domestic dependent nations. 1 year after Cherokee Nation v. Georgia, another Supreme Court case would affirm the sovereignty of the Cherokee Nation, with Worcester v. Georgia, in which Chief Justice John Marshall affirmed that the relationship between Indian nations and the United States is that of nations. The modern era finds the powers of tribal sovereigns in flux. Tribal governments have immunity to lawsuits as sovereigns, but the federal government can force tribal governments to waive that immunity if it sees fit. Sovereign immunity does not extend to individual citizens of tribes. Tribal sovereignty is also expressed in the tribe's ability to adjudicate on crimes committed on tribal lands. In states where Public Law 280 is in effect, federal law enforcement authority is transferred to the state with the permission of the tribes affected. In these states, the state government has jurisdiction over crimes committed by tribal members on tribal lands. Oklahoma is not a Public Law 280 state. The Muskogee Creek Nation Tribal Court's jurisdiction in criminal cases is determined by the classification of the perpetrator and victim as Indian or non-Indian. Federal court has jurisdiction over crimes defined by the Major Crimes Act, and in all other crimes, tribal courts have jurisdiction over Indian on Indian crimes and Indian on non-Indian crimes. Tribal courts have no jurisdiction over non-Indian offenders. Congress has plenary power over Native American tribes, and through legislation, the sovereign powers of tribes can be expanded or contracted.